That day, the atmosphere at one of the world's top universities was unusually quiet. Students from different backgrounds sat in neat rows, books and laptops open, as Professor Eleanor Hart stood at the front of the class. At 56, she had a commanding presence, her gray-streaked hair and crisp black suit adding to her air of authority. Known for her sharp intellect and outspoken atheism, she often argued that religion was just a social construct holding back rational thinking. Among the students sat Asia Malik, an 18-year-old with a calm, confident demeanor. Her gentle face and piercing gaze stood out, as did her dark blue hijab, which contrasted with the casual attire of her peers. Asia wasn't an ordinary student. She came from a highly educated Muslim family and was a Hafiz, someone who had memorized the entire Quran. The science and philosophy class began as usual. Professor Eleanor picked up a marker and boldly wrote on the board, "Does God really exist?" The room buzzed with whispers. Some students looked intrigued, while others shifted uncomfortably. With a faint smile, Professor Eleanor scanned the room. "Today," she began, her voice calm but sharp, "we'll tackle a question that's been debated for centuries. Is God real? Or is he just a creation of human imagination?" She paused, letting the words sink in. "Many of you believe in God, but do you have a solid reason for that belief? Or is it just because of tradition, or how you were raised?" Some students nodded, while others looked unsure. Professor Eleanor stepped closer to the center of the room. "I want someone to stand up and explain, using science and logic, why they believe in God." The room fell silent. No one dared to speak. They all knew the professor's reputation for dismantling arguments with ease. But then, in the middle row, Asia slowly raised her hand. Professor Eleanor raised an eyebrow, a hint of surprise in her expression. "Well, we have a volunteer," she said, a touch of sarcasm in her tone. "Please introduce yourself." Asia stood up, her gaze steady. "My name is Asia Malik," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "And I believe in God, not just because of faith, but because of science and logic." The room went still. All eyes turned to Asia. Professor Eleanor crossed her arms, studying the young woman. "All right, Asia," she said, a challenge in her eyes. "Give me one scientific reason that proves God exists." Asia took a deep breath, a small smile forming on her lips. She knew this wasn't just a casual discussion. It was a test of her faith in front of a skeptical audience. The students waited, some curious, others silently rooting for her. Professor Eleanor tilted her head, her tone skeptical. "Well, Asia, I'm waiting for a rational argument. Or did you not expect this question?" Asia remained calm. "Professor, before I answer, may I ask you something?" The professor hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead." "Do you believe that something complex and orderly requires a designer?" Asia asked. Professor Eleanor thought for a moment. "Of course. According to science, complex systems usually have a logical origin." Asia nodded. "So, if we see a watch with intricate, perfectly synchronized parts, we'd assume it had a maker, right?" "Yes, that's correct," the professor replied. Asia continued, her voice steady. "Then what about the universe? It's far more complex and orderly than a watch. Could something so incredible really exist without a creator?" The room fell silent again. Even the students who had seemed uninterested before were now paying close attention. Professor Eleanor's expression shifted slightly, as if she hadn't expected this response. The tension in the room was palpable, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. "Eleanor." The professor chuckled. "I'll admit, Asia, your argument is interesting, but it's too simple. Science has already shown that the universe began with the Big Bang, not a creator." Asia smiled. "Okay, Professor, your logic makes sense to me. But since we're talking about the Big Bang, I have a question. What caused the Big Bang to happen?" "Professor." Eleanor sighed. "Science says the Big Bang started from a tiny, super dense point called a singularity. It exploded and expanded, creating the universe we see today." Asia nodded slowly. "So, Professor, do you think something can come from nothing?" "Professor." Eleanor paused. She knew this wasn't an easy question. Science says energy can't be created or destroyed. It only changes form. That's the law of conservation of energy. Asia leaned in. Then where did the energy for the Big Bang come from? A murmur spread through the classroom as students whispered to each other. A guy in the back raised his hand. Professor, isn't Asia's question valid? If everything has a cause, shouldn't the universe have one too? Professor Eleanor hesitated, trying to regain control. That's a philosophical question, she said, but science doesn't need God to explain the universe. Asia smiled softly. Professor, I know science doesn't rely on God for answers, but doesn't that mean science has limits? Just because we can't explain something, does that mean it doesn't exist? The professor fell silent. She wasn't used to losing debates, but Asia wasn't an ordinary student. Her confidence was unshakable. Still, Professor Eleanor wasn't ready to back down. All right, Asia, she said, crossing her arms. Let's say there is a designer of the universe. How do you know it's the God you believe in? Why couldn't it just be natural laws working on their own? Asia took a deep breath. Professor, the laws of nature are part of that design. Gravity, thermodynamics, even the DNA in our bodies. They all follow precise, ordered patterns. Natural laws can't create themselves. Something had to create those laws. And that's what we call Allah in Islam, the Creator who made everything. A girl in the corner raised her hand nervously. If God is real, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why do we have wars, diseases, and natural disasters? Asia turned to her with a gentle smile. That's a great question. Let me ask you this. Can you truly understand happiness without ever feeling sadness? The room went quiet as the student thought about it. Asia continued, in Islam, this world is a test. Every hardship has a purpose, even if we don't see it right away. Think of a child who doesn't understand why their parents won't let them play with fire. The child doesn't know what the parents know. In the same way, God understands the wisdom behind what happens in our lives better than we do. The classroom fell silent. Many students who had been skeptical now seemed deep in thought. Professor Eleanor took a deep breath. She was still trying to find a way to counter Asia's points, but the girl remained calm and confident. Finally, the professor said, I have to admit, you're a skilled debater. She gave Asia a sharp look. But is your belief based on logic, or is it just emotional? Asia met her gaze without flinching. She knew this was the moment that mattered. Professor, she said firmly, my belief isn't just about feelings. I've seen God's miracles in my life. Every breath I take, every prayer I say, I feel His presence. It's not just logic, it's my reality. Her voice grew passionate. I believe in God because I've experienced Him, not just because I was told to. The truth finds those who truly seek it. The room fell silent. Even Professor Eleanor paused, her smile shifting from patronizing to thoughtful. Your answers are compelling, Asia. But one question remains. If God is real, why doesn't He show Himself? Why make us search? Asia smiled. Professor, do you believe love exists? Of course, the professor replied. Can you show me love? Can you put it on this table and say, here it is? Asia asked. Love is real, but we see it through actions, kindness, sacrifice, warmth. It's the same with God. We see Him in nature, in life, in the universe. Faith isn't about proof, it's about seeking truth. The professor hesitated. But if God wants us to believe, why not make it easier? Asia replied, if a teacher gives a test, do they hand out the answers first? This world is a test. Faith isn't about being forced to believe. It's about choosing to. A student, Michael, raised his hand. If God is just, why is there so much suffering? Why do bad people prosper? Asia asked, have you seen an artist paint? At first, it's just colors. You don't see the masterpiece until it's done. Life is like that. We don't see the full picture yet. Finally, the professor asked, "But what about religion? It's caused wars and harm. How do you defend that?" Asia replied, "Is a knife good or bad?" "It depends on how it's used," the professor said. "Exactly," Asia said. "A knife can hurt or heal. It's not the knife's fault how it's used." Professor Eleanor stayed quiet as Asia spoke. "Religion is just a tool," Asia continued. "When used right, it brings justice, kindness, and peace. But in the wrong hands, it can cause harm. The problem isn't religion itself. It's how people choose to use it." A few students clapped softly, impressed by Asia's thoughtful answer. The debate was heating up, and her response struck a chord with many. Professor Eleanor took a deep breath. Her expression shifted as she looked at Asia. There was something new in her eyes. Maybe respect, not just the desire to win. But she wasn't done yet. "Asia, you've given great answers," she said calmly. "But I have one last question for you." Asia stayed calm, ready for whatever came next. Professor Eleanor leaned in. "If God exists, have you ever experienced something that proves it?" The room went silent. All eyes were on Asia, waiting for her answer. Asia took a deep breath. She knew this wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about something real. "Yes," she said softly. "Not just once, but many times." She paused, looking around the room. "When I was 10, I was in a car accident. My mom and I were driving home when a truck lost control and came straight at us. I remember praying, 'God, please save us.'" The students listened intently, some visibly moved. "The truck should have hit us," Asia continued, "but at the last second, it swerved and hit a pole instead. No one was hurt. Some called it luck, but I knew it was more than that. I prayed, and God answered." Professor Eleanor's eyes softened, but Asia wasn't finished. "There are things we can't explain," she said, "like when you're at your lowest and help comes out of nowhere, or when you feel peace during prayer, even before your problems are solved. God doesn't always show up in ways we can see, but He's there, in the small miracles we miss, in the calm we feel when we need it most." The room stayed quiet. Even Professor Eleanor seemed touched, her eyes glistening. "Asia," she said quietly, "that's the most powerful explanation of faith I've ever heard." Asia smiled. "You don't have to believe me, Professor. Faith can't be forced. But I hope you'll think about it. Sometimes the truth isn't just what we can prove, it's what we feel." The class sat in silence, reflecting on her words. Finally, Professor Eleanor spoke again. "Asia, you've given me a lot to think about. Thank you." She turned to the class. "Let this be a lesson for all of us. Seek the truth with an open mind and an open heart." The students nodded, many deeply moved by the discussion. Moral of the story: faith isn't about forcing belief. It's about being open to the miracles around us. True understanding comes from both reason and feeling. And sometimes, the most powerful truths are the ones we feel in our hearts.